But what does Manu Chao have to do with the bongo? Well, no need. I will be taking attendance, but I'll be doing it after like the presentation starts, so that I can have an accurate count that I don't have to update every so often.
I did try to do it a couple times during the presentation as well.
Well, yes, I will. Or Avery. Oh, Avery's doing it. Hi, Avery. Well, I guess.
Okay, you want to hand the attendance over to Avery?
All right. Well, Avery, it's yours now, I guess.
Okay. Also, other co-hosts, please let Avery manage the waiting room. Okay, welcome to Science Friday. It's hosted by Journal Club. Journal Club is an organization led by a team of students and faculty members who train new people to present, dissect scientific journals, and most importantly, provide a forum for data-based discussion. We take on almost any relevant issue that you're passionate about. If you want to be trained as a presenter, or if you're a veteran presenter looking for a venue, please email Anya and we will work with you to make that happen. I want to take a moment to acknowledge a person on the Journal Club exec team. This week it is Avery. Give it up for Avery for her consistent and thoughtful work in Journal Club. The team is mentored by Dr. Paul Hauser and Luke D. There are 4 leaders. Akshar handles the training of people on our team. Anya handles the training of presenters, and Kira and I curate our talks and handle Science Friday itself. This is how our meeting today is going to run. Today, Jenna Lange, a founder of Science Friday, is going to present for about 20 minutes. There will be time for questions mid-presentation. Please type your questions into the chat as soon as you have them. The simpler, the better. We will organize them, either call on you or ask the question for you if you prefer. You can public or private chat your questions. Akshar will be taking care of them. This is how oh yes, indeed. During the presentation, we ask that you keep your cameras on and stay muted unless you're asked to clarify a question. There is a all-school meeting after this, so it is fine if you leave 5 minutes before at 12:15 if you want to get ready for our all-school meeting. We have a lot of exciting presentations coming up, including one about life on Mars and guest presenter Robert Zapolsky. But this week we have Jenna Lange, so please give it up for the presentation.
Hi, thank you all so much for having me. That was a really sweet introduction. I'm really glad that this whole Science Thursday thing is still happening. I am for those of you who I haven't met, I'm a sophomore at Pamona College, double majoring in philosophy and either molecular biology or neuroscience, still figuring that one out. But y'all can read. Today we're talking about fixed mindsets and inequality in academia, innate brilliance as a necessary condition for success, and I will get into what I mean by that. Oh dear. There we go. Before we start, I wanted to include a quick note on the difference between gender and sex. Not every woman is female and not every man is male. It's important to me to use language that is as accurate and inclusive as possible. That said, in order to discuss data on representation in academic disciplines, I find rough categories useful. And for this reason, I will often opt to use the biological terms male and female in this presentation. But the study of gender and gender identity has a whole field of study devoted to it. It's a lot more complicated than I'm going to get into here. I've linked a place to start if you're curious about that. But using some very rough categories for the purposes of this talk. So I personally see a lot of messaging about getting more women into STEM and messaging about how STEM is for everyone. And I think that these messages are really, really important, but they aren't the whole story when it comes to representation across academic disciplines, because there are balanced STEM fields and there are unbalanced humanities fields. So this is data from the National Science Foundation's survey of earned doctorates. So here I'm using PhDs awarded as a proxy for representation in a discipline. So these bars represent percentage of doctorate recipients who are male in blue and female in red. So on the far right side of this distribution, we have the most male-heavy disciplines, including physics and astronomy, computer science, all the engineering fields, math and stats, econ, chemistry, political science, and business. And on the far left, we have the most female-heavy disciplines, including psychology, education, health sciences, anthropology, foreign language and lit, and communications. This is just a sampling of some of the doctorates. To get it to fit on a slide, I couldn't include all of them. But this is just to give you an idea of, in the 10 years between 2011 and 2019, what the gender distribution looked like. So as you can see, there are a lot of STEM fields over here on the right. So some of the most male-heavy disciplines are STEM fields, and there are also fields like econ and political science and business that are really male-heavy. And on the far left side, We do have a lot of humanities and social science fields like psych and education, but we also have fields like health sciences, and biomedical sciences. So as you can see, the defining factor in what makes a field have a gender unbalance is not necessarily just the STEM versus humanities and social science divide. If that data felt a little overwhelming, here's an anecdotal example. In 2011, 54% of PhDs in molecular biology in the United States were awarded to people identifying as women. And in the same country in the same year, only 30% of philosophy PhDs went to women. So it's clear that the STEM humanities distinction isn't the key factor here, and women in STEM, while important, isn't the whole picture of what needs to happen in terms of gender equality in academia. So that leads me to the big question for this talk.
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt. There
yeah,
was
please do.
About 2 slides ago.
Yeah.
About the all engineering section. So do you want to ask the question? Eli?
Are all engineering fields equally male skewed, or is that just like an average that is not? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So thank you for asking that question. When I crunched these numbers, I needed to group some of the kinds of doctorates in order to make it fit. But all engineering includes things like chemical engineering and aerospace engineering. They were all pretty male heavy, but with some differences between them. I'm so happy to send you the data if you want to look at it. But they were all pretty male heavy, though there was some variance in between. Does that help? Awesome. Also, if you do have questions, please chat Akshar and interrupt me. Great. So, all of that said, that leads me to the big question for this talk, which is what makes a field more likely to have an unbalanced gender distribution, because it's clear that it isn't just the STEM versus social sciences and humanities divide. So in order to answer this question, I looked at Leslie et al.'s study on the role of fixed mindset in gender distributions. So the title of their paper is Expectations of Brilliance Underlie Gender Distributions Across Academic Disciplines. And their hypothesis in this paper has to do with the role of fixed mindset and stereotype threat in gender representation. So just a quick quote from their paper. We hypothesize that across the academic spectrum, women are underrepresented in fields whose practitioners believe that raw innate talent is the main requirement for success, because women are stereotyped as not possessing such talent. So in order to frame this in the language of fixed mindset, I've constructed an if-then because I like those. If one believes that innate brilliance is necessary for success in a field, then they have a fixed mindset view of learning that field. So we can frame Leslie et al.'s hypothesis in terms of this language by saying that their hypothesis is that due to stereotype threat, females are most underrepresented in highly fixed mindset fields. I think that this framing is useful because it puts Leslie et al.'s hypothesis in the language of fixed versus growth mindset, which is an academic field that there's a lot of research in, and also that I find Nueva students to be pretty familiar with, so I wanted to use that language. So in order to test their hypothesis, Leslie et al. Set out to quantify field-specific ability beliefs. So they did a survey of faculty, postdocs, and grad students, 1,820 of them to be precise, in 30 different academic fields at universities across the US. These participants were presented with statements like, being a top scholar of insert discipline here requires a special aptitude that just can't be taught. And they were asked to rate first their agreement with the statements and two, the agreement of others in their discipline with the statements. These answers were averaged to produce a field-specific ability belief score for each discipline, where higher scores indicate emphasis on innate brilliance. So the field-specific ability belief score, the higher the score, the higher the fixed mindset of experts in the discipline with respect to their particular discipline. So the measure here was a survey tool that set out to quantify how fixed the mindset is of experts in a discipline about success in their discipline specifically. I'm going to pause for questions in case anybody has any about how the quantification worked for this study.
Yeah, I think a question just came out.
Awesome. I can't see any of y'all, so you're going to have to be assertive.
I was wondering if it's the reason that certain groups of people might not participate or come up as much in a field because they don't believe that they possess innate talent, or is it that the other people in the field who are already like successful don't believe they possess talent, or is it like a combination of both?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking this question. I think that's you're getting at a really important distinction. So Leslie et al.'s hypothesis is that the fixed mindset of the experts already in a field is what impacts how hospitable that field is to women. So it is in Leslie et al.'s hypothesis, they believe that their hypothesis is that people in a field who believe that you have to have innate talent to succeed in the field, though the people who are already experts are the people who have that impact because of stereotype threat on students in that field. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah. I think that that distinction is really important, and I will get into it a little bit later. And if I don't, please bother me about it.
Jenna, could I throw a question out too?
Yeah, go for it.
Do they use this to explain the female overrepresentation in the other direction? Like if because I feel like there's two ways to explain it. One, you could say, well, let's say early childhood education is not a fixed mindset discipline, and that explains, at least that there wouldn't be the stereotypes type threat. But I could see it there another explanation, which is that it also is a fixed mindset field, except here the assumption is that women have the innate talent more than men, and so that's so there's a positive sort of stereotype, not threat or effect, going to explain why there's more female representation in psych or early childhood education or whatever. Something that there is a perception, perhaps, that innate talent is more held more often by women than by men.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that so it seems like what you're saying is that there's a similar hypothesis that may or may not be compatible with Leslie et al.'s, where positive stereotypes, which positive is a term of art there because we agree that stereotypes generally narrow the way that we see people regardless of whether they're good stereotypes. But there's another hypothesis that says that positive stereotypes, including that women are nurturing or particularly good with children, influence how many women go into fields like psychology and education. So Leslie et al. Talk about that in their paper, and it's really well written and not very long. So if anyone has a second, and it's also, the PDF is free online. So if anyone has a second and wants to read it, I think that it's super interesting. The idea that positive stereotypes influence which disciplines women are allowed to go into is something that they discuss in the paper as one of the competing hypotheses. And I think competing is not necessarily a great framing because they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. But the way that hypothesis interacts with the field-specific ability beliefs hypothesis, I think is really interesting and really important, and I'm glad that you brought it up. I know that's not quite an answer, but it's more of like a read the thing, it's cool type answer.
Awesome, thank you.
That help? Yeah, for sure. Sweet.
Right, there are two other questions.
Great.
The first one is, how is innate talent measured?
Oh, cool. I'm glad that came up because that indicates that I'm not being precise enough about what was being measured. So innate talent is not actually what they're measuring. What Leslie et al. Set out to measure is whether or not experts in a discipline feel that innate talent is necessary. So they are not measuring who has innate talent for a discipline. What they are measuring is whether experts in a field, so professors, feel that innate talent is necessary for success in a field. So what they're measuring is the beliefs of experts in a field about innate talent. They're not measuring innate talent. And that's a super important distinction because I think any attempt to quantify intelligence is sort of fundamentally problematic. And if anyone wants to talk about like IQ tests and the problems with those, we can talk about that later. But the thesis is that they're not measuring innate talent, they're measuring perception of innate talent by experts in a field. Does that help? Also, this might have been an anonymous question. I don't want to make anyone out themselves, but I think that I answered it. And Akshay, what was the other question?
I think it's all right for us to move on for now. We can get back to it if you have any constraints.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that seeing some graphs will start to clear this stuff up because I think this is a very wordy slide. It sort of breaks all the Luke D presentation rules. So Leslie et al. Graphed field-specific ability belief scores, and percentage of PhDs awarded to females. And this is the graph that includes just STEM fields. But as you can see, the higher the field-specific ability belief score, the fewer PhDs are awarded to women in STEM fields. So the more fixed mindset we have, the more fixed mindset we have about what makes, I'm just gonna start that sentence over. The more fixed the mindset is in a field about whether you need some kind of innate brilliance in order to succeed in the field, the fewer women get PhDs in that field. So another way of saying that is that when a lot of experts in a field have fixed mindsets about learning that field, the fewer women get PhDs in that field. So if we look at a field like physics, there's a pretty high field-specific ability belief score. It's around 4.4. And only about 20% of women get PhDs in that field. But when we look at a field like neuroscience, which has a lower field-specific ability belief score, meaning that there's more growth mindset in that field as opposed to fixed mindset, more women get PhDs in that field. And we see a really similar distribution with humanities fields. So fields like education, with a highly growth mindset compared to other fields, have a lot of PhDs awarded to women, and fields like philosophy, which have extraordinarily high field-specific ability belief scores, have very few PhDs awarded to females. So the more fixed mindset there is, the fewer women get PhDs in that humanities field. I just wanted to specifically highlight philosophy because I'm a philosophy major, and this is disappointing to me that a lot of philosophy professors believe that there's some kind of innate brilliance necessary for success in it, because, at least in my experience, everyone has at least one part of philosophy that they're really innately good at, and we also all have things that we really have to work at and really suck at, because there are a lot of different kinds of skills and ways of thinking that are necessary for success in this field. So everyone has to work on different things, but no one's just like good at it. And I think that that's true of a lot of fields, or at least that's my belief. So the takeaway from these two figures is that in both STEM and humanities fields, the more fixed the mindset, the fewer PhDs go to women. So returning to the big question, what makes a field more likely to have an unbalanced gender distribution? The answer from Leslie et al. Is that experts with fixed mindset views of their field make women less likely to succeed in that field. So from this study, there seems to be a connection between the fixed mindset views of experts in a field and how hospitable that field is or is not to women. I'm going to pause here for questions really quickly before I get into another implication of Leslie et al.'s study. Did that all make sense? I know I just talked to a lot of you.
I think there's a question from Wes from earlier, if you'd like to.
Yeah, shoot.
Sure. I was wondering if the study accounts for any potential discrepancy between how respondents self-report versus how they behave. So what I'm thinking of is like, if you design a survey where you ask people questions about like, do people deserve equal treatment? Essentially, like, do you have racist beliefs, right? Like most people will say no, almost everyone will say no, but their actions may indicate otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This is an invitation for me to be more precise with my language about correlation versus causation. So I really appreciate this question. So what Leslie et al. Are demonstrating is that there's a correlation between how experts report on their fixed mindset views and how many women get PhDs in that discipline. So I think we could speculate a couple possible mechanisms for how we get from experts who report fixed mindset views to number of women PhDs in that field. One of those mechanisms is that it seems to me possible that if an expert believes, if a professor believes that you need some kind of innate brilliance to be good at their field, they're going to be more likely to give up on students who don't immediately seem to have that kind of brilliance. And that perception of brilliance is automatically, no matter who the expert is, no matter what their identity is, it is going to be colored by the stereotyping that we all implicitly have about students in a classroom. For example, women who in a classroom making points up talk, like ask every point like it's a question, are there's a really interesting paper about this if anyone wants to read it, but are demonstrably taken less seriously than women who do not speak that way, because we all implicitly have these kinds of biases. So the mechanisms of how we get from reported fixed mindset to women PhDs, I think there are a lot of possible ways that we could get there. But what Leslie et al. Are demonstrating is that there's a correlation between these two things. Does that answer your question?
Okay. It does, thank you.
Great, thank you.
I also saw a hand from Barack, although it's dropped now, so just in case.
Actually, Akshar, would you mind if we just I would just kind of want to let Jenna continue a little bit with the presentation. There's a lot of questions coming up, and I just want to make sure that she gets the momentum she needs. Great.
I will keep doing the thing. I'm excited for questions at the end though, because I think that this brings up a lot of things for people. So another interesting implication of Leslie et al.'s paper is that the field-specific ability beliefs hypothesis extends to racial representation. So the more fixed mindset there is in a field, we've already shown that the more fixed mindset, that fields with highly fixed mindset are correlated with fewer women PhDs. It turns out that the same is true of PhDs awarded to African Americans, which is really disappointing. And it also is sort of more evidence for this field-specific ability beliefs hypothesis, the idea that the more fixed mindset a field is, the more stereotype threat impacts people interested in that field. So this got me curious about racial representation and fixed mindset, which led me to a paper by Canning et al., which is about faculty's fixed mindsets and racial achievement gaps. So what they found is that STEM faculty who believe that ability is fixed have larger racial achievement gaps and inspire less student motivation in their classes. The student motivation stuff was really interesting. They looked at student course feedback responses, like you do a Google form or a Qualtrics survey at the end of a thing, but I'm going to focus much more on the racial achievement gaps part because that's what is more directly relevant to this question. But if anyone wants to go read this, it's very cool. It's also free, would recommend. So what Canning et al. Did is a survey of faculty in 13 different STEM fields at a single large public university across 7 semesters. So these faculty were presented with statements like, to be honest, students have a certain amount of intelligence and they can't really do much to change it, and asked to rate their agreement with the statements. And these answers were averaged to produce a lay beliefs about intelligence score, where higher scores indicate fixed mindset. So this is very similar to Leslie et al.'s field-specific ability beliefs thing. They're just using a slightly different survey metric. And the dependent measure in this case was not number of PhDs awarded, but was instead students' grades in courses taught by the STEM faculty respondents. So they just used the college records for this. They used a regression model that controlled for confounding factors like students' previous achievement measured by SAT scores. SAT scores are a very fundamentally problematic measure of achievement, but they were one of the ways that Canning et al. Canning et al. Accounted for confounding factors. So they measured the fixed mindset of professors, and as a dependent measure, they looked at students' grades in courses taught by those faculty. And what they found is that faculty with fixed mindsets have much higher racial achievement gaps. Quoting from their paper, fixed faculty mindset beliefs were more strongly associated with lower course performance among Black, Latino, Native American, or underrepresented minority URM students than among white and Asian students. And the racial achievement gaps in courses taught by fixed mindset STEM faculty were twice as large as the achievement gaps in courses taught by more growth mindset faculty. So as you can see in this figure on the right, these lighter gray bars are the STEM course grades of white and Asian students, and the darker gray bars are the STEM course grades of underrepresented minority students. And in professors with fixed mindsets, you can see that this racial achievement gap between white and Asian students and underrepresented minority students is depressingly big. And then on the right, you can see that the racial achievement gap between white and Asian students and underrepresented minority students is less big. So what we can conclude from Canning et al.'s paper is that faculty who have fixed mindsets about what it takes to succeed in their discipline specifically have larger racial achievement gaps in their classrooms than professors with growth mindsets. So from Leslie et al., we can conclude that Leslie et al.'s paper indicates that fields with more fixed mindset experts have fewer women in them. And from Canning et al., we see that professors with fixed mindset views have wider racial achievement gaps in their classrooms. So I find this really interesting because as a Nueva student, I read and learned a lot about what having a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset does to a student and how that impacts your learning personally. But these two papers, as well as an expanding body of research, indicate that professors and teachers with fixed mindsets actually seem to have an impact on how accessible their field is to women and to racial minorities. So I think that this is a really interesting and meaningful dimension that adds to the body of research on fixed versus growth mindset. So I thought it was for a journal club talk. I hope that this was interesting and or valuable to you. I hope it made you want to read things. Those are my sources, and I think we have a couple of minutes for questions if anyone is interested, and that is what I have to say. The end. Should I stop my share so I can see you all? I don't know how to do this.
Well, I think it might be helpful to refer to the slides. We'll see.
Okay, sweet.
There's a question from Lachlan, which if you'd like to say it out loud.
Sure. So within a certain field, there are experts with fixed mindsets. So do you know what the divide between, say, women and men for those fixed mindsets is? Say, what percentage of experts in mathematics have a fixed mindset who are women as opposed to who are men?
That is such a fascinating question. I have no idea. You would think that if Leslie et al., hang on, we're going to go back so that we can be looking at something that's relevant to this question. Sweet. So you'd think that if Leslie et al. Had collected information, the demographic information about the faculty, graduate students, and postdocs that they were interviewing, that they were surveying, that you would be able to study that. I don't know if they did collect demographic information. I need to read the fine print on the study. I think that that's super interesting, and I would love to look into it. But my short answer to your question is I have no idea, and I need to do some more reading. I know that that's unhelpful, but I think it's an interesting question.
All right. And does Barack still have his question from earlier?
No, Jenna, you answered my question when you were answering Wes's question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to both Barack and Wes for challenging me to have more precise language about correlation versus causation, because that is such a fallacy, and I should have thought about that before.
Oh, no. You answered it sort of as a sidelight. I wasn't going to challenge your precision. My question was, I don't actually remember right now, but it was shoot. I'll come back later.
It's good to see all of you, by the way. I miss Nueva. It's a good place.
Likewise.
We love a good Zoom awkward silence. Luke D, you have a question.
Hey, Jenna.
Hi.
So I guess I'm curious about something. I think I'm making an assumption here, but I think a lot of us are going into this with the belief that a growth mindset is a good thing, and that it would be antithetical to racial divide and gender divides. But I was wondering how I could even attempt to prove or to examine the alternate or null hypothesis here, that like a fixed mindset might actually be a good thing. Because anytime anybody's using the term fixed mindset, I think we've already kind of assumed that the growth mindset is a good thing. I'm just curious about, I'm just thinking about ways we could try to examine the null here.
Yeah, I guess this is going to be such a philosophy major answer, but I guess a follow-up question that I have to your follow-up question is that I think we need to be really precise about in what way we think that a growth mindset is a good thing. So I think it's been pretty clearly demonstrated that a growth mindset enables a student to learn more effectively and to not have their self-esteem destroyed when they fail a midterm, for example. So I think that that the literature pretty clearly demonstrates that a growth mindset is a good thing for a student to have for the sake of their own learning. And what this talk focused on is that a growth mindset is a good thing for a professor to have in order to foster equality in their classroom and more broadly in their field of study. So those are two ways that I think growth mindset is really helpful. But I think a good thing broadly, I think we just have to be precise about in what respect we mean that in order to answer your question. But I think it's an important one. Oh my goodness, there are hands up. Akshay, are you calling on people or am I?
Yeah, I can. Amrita was next, I think.
Okay, do you know so for the like PhDs of women, do you know what's the percentage of the people who get PhDs out of the people in the field? Because if the number of PhDs is lower, isn't it possible that it's because the number of like women in that field itself is lower, and that's because of maybe like lower opportunities or things like other factors like that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. It gives me an opportunity to clarify something. So I think what you're asking is whether or not PhDs awarded is a good measure of how many women are in a field.
Or like when it has like the number of PhDs, is that the number of PhDs of like women in general, or number of PhDs of women out of the women in total, like whether they get PhDs or not? Like is it percentage of PhDs or just number?
Yeah, it's the percentage of the PhDs awarded in that field that went to women. So in neuroscience, there are a certain amount of PhDs that go out every year. And right around 51% of those PhDs in the year that Leslie et al. Looked at went to women. So the percentage of PhDs that went to women in that field in that year was about 51%. But that is the percentage of PhDs in that field that went to women. So we're looking at specifically what is the proportion of the PhDs that were awarded that went to women. Does that help?
Yeah, so just like adding on to that, did people find that the like ratio of women to men that have PhDs is similar to the ratio of women to men in the field itself?
Oh, interesting. In Leslie et al.'s paper, they were looking at PhDs as a proxy for the number of women in the field. So there are a lot of people studying a thing, like I'm studying philosophy, so you could argue that like I'm in philosophy. And at the same time, what Leslie et al. Were looking at as their measure of how many women are in a field is the number of women who have PhDs in that field. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, of course. I could have been more precise. I appreciated the opportunity to clarify.
All right, and then there's a question from Nick, and then maybe Dee's hand is still up because he means for it to be, or
He doesn't.
I was just curious, like, and this is like sort of trying to build off of what Mukti mentioned earlier. Do we think, I guess two questions. One, do you think that innate ability exists, I guess? And two, is there, even if it does, is it better if we sweep it under the rug? Like, I guess, and this is back to like, is a growth mindset really better? Like, do you think the perspective that everyone has equal, I guess, opportunity or potential to succeed in a field is true? And I guess if it's not, does it matter? Like, in that, like, should we adopt, should we adopt a growth mindset even if it's not backed up by the evidence?
Sweet. So in order to get into that, I think I need to make a quick distinction. So these papers that I was looking at do not look at whether innate ability is true or whether like innate ability predicts how many PhDs we get or whether innate ability, like it's just looking at perception of whether innate ability is necessary. So neither of these papers tried to measure innate ability in any way or tried to like compare that to the number of people who succeed in that discipline. That said, I think that your question is interesting and important, and it's a different question than the one I was focused on in this presentation, but I think that it's really important. So questions of innate intelligence are like fundamentally thinking about what that means I think that is super interesting, and my intro psych professor would go off about that forever. There are people who like study that, like what is intelligence and what does it mean to measure it, and how is like innate intelligence, if that is a thing, how does that affect performance in school? So that is a whole other field of study that is so interesting. There are a lot of people who argue that any attempt to measure intelligence is fundamentally problematic because it imposes a dominant paradigm of what intelligence is, which is overwhelmingly Western, and it subscribes to a very particular view of what intelligence is. Side note, a lot of people think that Kantian philosophy is fundamentally Eurocentric for this reason, because he builds his moral philosophy and everything on the fundamental assumption that there exists a universal reason that everyone has access to, which a lot of later thinkers would not agree with. So anyway, ideas about measuring intelligence are fascinating and important, and that's not at all what I was trying to do here, but I do think that this brings up questions like that, and it's something that there's so much interesting reading to do on it. Does that not answer your question, but does that begin to open
Really,
doors?
I asked it because I wanted to hear you talk about it, and it's interesting to me also, and you did. So
great, fantastic.
Okay, thank you.
I'm making
everybody.
note.
Yes, thank you everybody for coming. Nueva students, we have a mandatory school meeting at this moment, so I think all students are going to leave. I think that means we have to end the meeting. If you have any questions, please feel free to email any of the journal club's heads or Jenna. I'm happy. I mean, she mentioned a lot of other resources, and if you're eager to find those, please just let us know. I hope to see you guys next week. We have exciting presentations coming up about life on Mars and such things. But see you then. Thank you, everybody.
Willow, would you mind just making me host so that maybe some of the adults who don't have to go to a meeting could maybe continue to talk?
Adults who don't need to go to meetings.
I'm not an
Feel free
adult.
to stay.
I'm not an